Welcome to Talking Beats with Daniel Lelchuk. We hope you'll subscribe and give us a 5-star review on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere you get your podcasts. Now, if you like the show, please consider supporting us at patreon.com/talkingbeats. That's patreon.com/talkingbeats. We believe now more than ever in providing a platform for individuality, free thought, and a diverse range of views. By supporting the show this way, you'll get early access to episodes, bonus episodes, and much, much more. Remember, the conversation is always active at Talking Beats Podcast on social media. Here's Daniel Lelchuk.
On today's program, writer André Aciman is here. He's the author of acclaimed works, both fiction and nonfiction, including Enigma Variations, Out of Egypt, a memoir, and the smash hit Call Me By Your Name. He's out with a new book of essays called Homo Irrealis, which he defines as, quote, a category of verbal moods that indicate that certain events have not happened, may never happen, or should or must or indeed are desired to happen, but for which there is no indication they ever will happen. Irrealis moods are also known as counterfactual moods, all best expressed as the might be and the might have been. A writer of beautiful prose, a thinker who makes us think more broadly, more deeply, not just of the past that happened, but also the past that might have happened but didn't. I'm very happy he's here right now with me. André Aciman, welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
How we fantasize, how we remember, these are the two dimensions of our lives. To live in the present under the midday sun is almost impossible. I'm quoting you. What does this mean? Where did you come to first believe this?
Well, I started by writing a memoir. And that is the first thing I wrote or published, because I was always writing everything else, usually fiction. But I figured that memoir writing was closer and easier to do. And in fact, as I was writing, I was realizing that I was constantly remembering things, and better yet, discovering things that I had totally obliterated or never thought about. But the very process of writing sort of summoned them up. And so I began realizing that, of course I had a font of memories that were there, but there were also those that had never been remembered before. And I said, this is strange, because these memories never left me. They're with me. And when you say that your memories are with you, what you really mean is that they are almost hounding you. They are there, they're present. They're sometimes not even allowing you to accept the present or the circumstances where you find yourselves at the present. You're not really allowed to accept them on their own terms. You're constantly changing what you're seeing so that it kind of adheres to something that you're familiar with from your past. And I realize this about myself, that in fact, I don't accept New York on its own terms. The parts of New York that I do like are parts that remind me of other places. It's almost like a refusal to be where you are or where life has just put you. But then when I think back, I realize that even when I was in my homeland, or whatever you want to call it, Egypt, where I was born and where I was supposed to live the rest of my life, I realized that I didn't like Egypt, and that was not even my home, and that therefore I was constantly drifting in my imagination elsewhere. So to conclude, basically, I'm in New York, remembering Egypt, remembering Rome, where I had to live for a few years, remembering Paris also, longing for those places. And yet, when I'm in Rome or I'm in Egypt, I'm constantly looking ahead to a time when I won't be in Rome and I won't be in Egypt. So essentially, I'm not even an exile, because an exile knows where he belongs and has lost his home. I don't think I ever had a home, so I'm constantly drifting, and the thing becomes sort of compounded when you realize that you're drifting in time as well, not only in place. That time as well is the thing that sort of throws you completely off your whatever orbit you think you're on.
How does thinking about time changed the place. And I just want to, before you answer or expound, I just want to read what you wrote about Alexandria, the 4 sentences. This is from early on in your new book of essays that I'm holding right here. You write, André Aciman, when I remember Alexandria, it's not only Alexandria I remember. When I remember Alexandria, I remember a place from which I like to imagine being already elsewhere. To remember Alexandria without remembering myself longing for Paris in Alexandria is to remember wrongly. Being in Egypt was an endless process of pretending I was already out of Egypt. How is that colored by the passage of time?
Well, then you realize that if you've never been sort of really rooted in one place because your mind was constantly drifting elsewhere and has sort of made that a habit, you also realize that the past tense is never quite the past tense. It's a past tense that's riddled with things that might have happened in the past, and that even though they never happened and might have happened, they have acquired the status of memories as well. In other words, you remember yourself at the age of 14 longing for someone, and that longing has remained as if it too has sort of claimed to become a memory. So memory is not only the repository of things done, but of things that have never been done and that were put off or were thrown into the future, or some uncertain future. And then when you look at the future as well, you realize that the future is filled with these moments that might yet occur, which is why I keep repeating that same sentence in each of the essays that I wrote in Homo Irrealis, which is the things that might have been, that never were, but might still happen, though you fear they will and hope that they might. In other words, it's a troublesome sentence that probably makes no sense, but it encapsulates this ability to sort of to belong in a time zone that also doesn't exist. So, in fact, I'm not only in a place that doesn't really exist, even though I'm in New York and I live on 109th Street, and you probably can hear the sirens all the time because I'm near a hospital. But at the same time, I'm not in New York. I've never been in New York. Just as I'm never in the present, I'm not in the past, I'm not in the future. I'm in some sort of dreamed up, fictive landscape where I think that life is better. And in a book I wrote almost 10 years ago, I call that landscape, if you've ever been on Lake Como and you're on one of the banks of Lake Como, you look over and you can catch the lights of Bellagio. And Bellagio is a magical place, a magical little town at the very tip in the middle of Lake Como. And you ask yourself, this is where the magic of life really starts. Life is always happening on the other bank, not on the bank you're in. And I think when I sort of say this, everybody disclaims it, everybody thinks they live in the present. And then when you ask them to reflect upon it, you realize that every person on planet Earth is, in fact, sort of constantly rudderless and sort of skidding from one time zone into another, from one imaginary place to another. Everybody is, as I like to call it, skidding, because you're not in place. We want to claim we are, and we hope we are. And to our best friends even, we say, I live in the present. These are the things that count for me, my job, my family, my this, my that. And then you ask them, a simple question that I always ask people when they give me this present tense mania of theirs. I say, where would you like to be buried? Because being buried in a place ultimately might give your whole trajectory of life a sense of purpose, closure, meaning, whatever. And nobody knows the answer.
As you know, I'm a cellist, and there's nothing more important, well, maybe sound, but there's nothing more important in music than time. And when you're playing a suite of Bach or a Mozart symphony or world premiere, there's nothing more important than time. And you speak about being in the present and not being in the present. And in music, we always think we have to be in the present and in the future and in the past all at the same time. And the reason is because the present is the execution of the notes right then, the note that you're playing, but the past is the musical structure, the architecture that preceded it, that came before, that makes the current moment make sense, and the future is how the piece is going to come to a conclusion, how one note links to the next, and has to do with the breathing. And what Mozart said was that the silences between the notes are just as important as the notes themselves.
I agree. And I think Schnabel said the same thing too. The idea that it's the silence between the notes, that time that goes by, that every great genius pianist, not all of them can, is to allow the silence to also speak. And if I can draw the parallel, I think that it's the silence between places, the silent, sort of so what do you call it, the bar note, the note that does not exist because it's a stop. What do you call that when the music stops, actually, when you're told
A
to stop?
fermata.
Yes. Well, yeah.
Well, a fermata
There's
is
a
when you
moment.
hold a note, but when it stops is just a
Yes.
pause.
Yes. But it's the pauses we live in the pauses, I think, not in the notes. We need the notes. Of course, we need the notes. We need love in our life. We need everything in our life. But it's the pauses that allow us to sort of drift into a place that is ours and ours only. And nobody can come in there, no matter how many doors we leave open. Because that's one thing you learn in life, that you are always, even in the best of company, you're always alone.
When did you first realize that? Was it looking back at that last photo of you when you were 14, 15 years old? Was you talk about that person being you and not being you, and you not being that person and being that person, running away from each other? Talk about that photo. Talk about how it connects to a sense of alone.
Well, that photo was taken by my father, and probably the last few weeks we were in Egypt. We went on an excursion outside of the city in a place that usually is just desert, and he liked the desert a lot. So we would go to the desert, and eventually we'd find a little resting place. And he took a picture of me, and it's my last picture in Egypt. And I look at the picture and I say, "My God, what happened to this person? Who is he? Who was he supposed to become that he was never allowed to become because he had to be transplanted to Italy in a way that was not pleasant at all. He lived in a terrible neighborhood in Rome. He then migrated to the United States, had to do all kinds of jobs. Did he know any of this? Of course he couldn't have known. Was he excited by it? I don't think he was. He just feels that a part of him is going to go away and a part of him is going to stay behind. And I've used that metaphor a few times in the past because it's what they call about the amputated limb syndrome. In other words, they cut off your hand, and the hand or the arm stays in your birthplace, in my case, Egypt, and the rest of your body moves to the United States. Of course, you've learned to do the work of a whole body. Your one arm does the work of two, and you kind of live with one arm. Okay, that's fine enough. I can do this. And then you realize one day, it wakes you up, that no, the whole body stayed behind. You are just an arm that traveled to the United States. In other words, your whole identity is not with you. Then what is it that you have with you, if not your whole identity? And that's, of course, it's a metaphor that is piled on itself, and of course loses its poignancy because it doesn't make sense at some point. But it makes sense in the middle course of that metaphor. You realize I'm just a half person, or I'm half a body, or half of this, or even not even a part of me just got away. The rest is still locked up in Egypt. So when I look at the boy in that picture that my father took, he's still in Egypt. He's saying, did you become who you thought you were going to be? And then I ask him, are you happy where you are? Where you stayed behind? Did your life happen to you the way you hoped it would? And of course, neither of us can even speak to the other.
Don't you think that's a reason humans go to art, is to complete that missing portion?
Of course it is. Of course it is. And I think that art is, in fact, it's first of all, I think it's the most profound way of speaking about our life, of our humanity, of what it is that we go through when we go through life. It is the most profound way to address this and to tackle it as honestly and as candidly as we can, um, because that is what art does. Art is, in fact, it completes life, and I've said that basically. I said it about music, but I might as well say it about art. Art is basically the repository of the things we never did and wish we had done. It is the song of our regrets, which is why I love so much the A minor quartet by Beethoven. It's basically, it plays out all those things that not only Beethoven never could do in his life, as he's approaching the end of his life and he knows it, but it speaks to us about the things that mattered the most to us and that we hoped to accomplish and may never be able to.
I love your description. It makes me think of all of the wonderful composers that I've been living with since I first started studying music when I was 4.5 years old. And I think of all the pieces that grow and evolve with me as they do with you, a listener, and anybody else. And you feel like you have no connection to Schubert. You know, he lived 1797 to 1828 in Austria. Nothing to do with you, but he has everything to do with you. He knows you.
I totally agree with you. It doesn't matter that he lived in a different country, in a different hemisphere, at a different period of history, with certain privileges, none of the ones that we have. He didn't have Diet Coke, for example, which I used to be addicted to, and things like that. But at the same time, Schubert's sonatas, for example, they speak to us in a way that tells us, stop doing what you're doing and listen to this, because this is actually completing your life. And I think that's what music does for me, at least. It completes, it is the unsung parts of my life that I will never be able to sing and that I have to listen to somebody else play in order to say, yes, this is what I wanted in life. Of course, that's not what music is, but that is how it speaks to me. And I'm sure it speaks to you in a different way and to third person in a totally different way. But it is the song of my regrets. It's not even the song, it's the, what in Yiddish is the geschrei of my regrets. The way you wish you could scream your regrets, the things that never happened, the things that you will never be able to do. Those are sort of certainly begin to haunt you as you approach probably the last decade of your life.
It's one of the things I never understood when people say to me, well, how can classical music be relevant? And I'm putting that word in huge quotations because I hate it. And I hate the question. I hate the word relevant. I have a feeling you agree with me. The relevance to me is from the emotional resonance it has with a listener or with a player. That's as relevant as anything could possibly be.
Well, I mean, I totally agree with you. And in my case, it was always literature. And, I lived in Rome in a place that was really ugly. I think it's very ugly, although other people think it's perfectly normal.
Where in
But
Rome?
in near the Alberone district on Via Pianuova, which is it's not even working class any longer. It's just sort of middle class. And there was nothing to it. I mean, it wasn't that ugly because when I've gone back, it's okay. But I was sort of hiding. And from that scene, I didn't want to look at it. So I would always sort of shut the shutters so I wouldn't have to look outside. And I would read books all day long. And I was reading the Russian classics. Now, if you think about it, Dostoevsky in St. Petersburg, killing a pawnbroker, what did that have to do with me? Nothing. And of course, it had everything to do with me. So I believe that anything you read does not have to be in your world or of your people or whatever. It can be something totally distant In fact, my favorite book, as I've said many times, is The Peloponnesian War, which was written probably 2,300 years ago. So we're talking about a thing that could not possibly be, to use your word, relevant. And yet it describes humanity in ways that I have known no other author to capture it so perfectly, in its stupidity, its meanness, its mistakes, uh, and the silliness of human beings. If you look at them, most human beings are quite silly.
How'd you come to love this book so much? When did you become introduced to it?
Oh, I think I was taking a course in college, and we were supposed to read a good part of it, not the whole book, but I read the whole book, and then I reread it many years later. What I found amazing is that every time he was giving a speech, a person was giving a speech, I totally agreed with it. Then there was the rebuttal to that speech. I agreed with it perfectly as well. Then there was a counter speech that was given in those sort of, what you might call them, sort of places where they discuss issues of politics. And I would find myself agreeing. So I was always agreeing with people who were saying very stupid things, and quite convincingly, in fact, that I found myself, this man has to be brilliant because I'm always agreeing with him, even when he tells me that the person speaking is totally wrong. So I just realized that there was something about his ability to penetrate the human psyche and disassemble it for me in a way that no other writer I know, or very few other writers, have been able to do that. And that's why I love that book, even though it's about war and it's about the ways in which wars are fought stupidly and to no avail, and ultimately a source of profound tragedy.
Look, I want to talk just a little bit about your background, a fascinating background. You're born into a Sephardic Jewish family in, as we've mentioned, Alexandria, Egypt. You grew up speaking French as your mother tongue. When things became very difficult for Jews in Egypt, your family left to Rome and to Paris. Talk about the culture. I think not a lot of people listening are going to be so aware of what a thriving, vibrant Jewish culture there was in Egypt up until the middle 20th century.
Yeah. Well, it was both Cairo and Alexandria, but Alexandria more so, maybe because it was on the seafront and sort of accessible to the West. These were totally westernized cities where you had people from all over the world who had come to settle and sort of had families there. And I don't think anyone was planning to leave. So you had people from all over Europe, Russia as well, India as well, and of course, people who could have gone to the United States, as members of my family did. One member, in fact, who ended up in St. Louis, hated it and decided, no, Egypt is a better place. And in fact, he lived quite happily for the rest of his life, having amassed quite a big fortune. And as did all his brothers and sisters. They all came to Egypt the way immigrants come to places, as in they come to the United States. And so you had this amazing culture, very rich and also extremely open and liberated in ways that even in France and England you would never imagine. For example, if you think of novels by Henry James, those could never have taken place in Egypt because this kind of ethical constipation, if you want to call it, didn't exist in Egypt. People were much freer with their morals and their bodies and so on. So and of course it was heavily cultural in the sense that the best performers, the best singers would always come to Alexandria. And I suppose, and of course the Cairo Opera House was opened by Giuseppe Verdi himself. The first performance of Aida took place there. So you had a world that was entirely westernized, the way people imagined Beirut was, though nothing close to Alexandria. And of course, after 1952, when the king was exiled, and rightfully so, And after 1956, when Gamal Abdel Nasser decided to nationalize the Suez Canal, there was a war with Britain and France and Israel, and they would have won if not the United States had sort of put a halt to it. And after which, the process of nationalizing everything and kicking out all the French and Italian and of course Jewish citizens. All these were everybody was kicked out to the point where most Greeks felt there's not much of a future here. The Armenians decided to go to Canada and the United States and Australia. So people, even if they weren't kicked out, they knew that there was no future in a country that had become exclusively Egyptian, which it never was. And so that culture disappeared. And I remember one day when the French theater company, the Comédie Française, came to Alexandria after almost a decade in 1965, and my mother was able to get us tickets, and we went to see the French plays of Molière and Marivaux. And suddenly I realized I'm in the wrong country. I like these plays. I want to be in a place where they have those plays all the time, not once every decade. And so there was a gradual disappearance of Jewish culture, of Italian culture, French culture, and of course of British culture as well. So that the Western outlook that was so dominant in Alexandria began to etiolate and disappear eventually.
I find the erosion of culture, the destruction, what you're talking about, the blatant moving backwards, sound like so tragic in a way.
Well, it is, and I belong to many Facebook pages that have Egypt as their sort of photographic repository, and I look at images of Alexandria as it is today. It looks very much like Miami. Some of the amazing and glorious villas that were built along the coast road have disappeared and been demolished, some of them totally illegally, because there is no real preservation going on. And they just build those high rises of hotels and big buildings. And so the whole architectural character of a city like Alexandria, which prided itself on buildings that were basically, the architects were all Italians or French, people who basically brought fantastic buildings to Alexandria. Those buildings have either been destroyed, or if you look at pictures, your heart breaks because you wouldn't step on the balcony if your life depended on it, because basically those balconies are about to collapse. The buildings are collapsing. And I'm always in, that's why one of the reasons why I love Sebald, the German writer, so much, is because he's constantly describing to you magnificent palatial hotels that have been that have almost collapsed, but are still operating with a small kitchen staff and maybe a few rooms still available for hotel guests who are traveling by and don't ask too many questions. You have a kind of dismantling of the old great culture of the 19th century, which may not have been great at all, let's face it, but nevertheless, the remnants of that 19th century are amazing, and we long for them. We recognize their shadow when we sort of walk into a place and we see an old building that is naturally closed because it cannot be renovated, because the funds needed to renovate such a building are no longer available. And so I complain on Facebook pages, why did Alexandria let itself go? And many Alexandrians would write back and say, because there is no money. And if there is no money, that means that the wealth that was once there, that built those villas and magnificent buildings, are not there anymore, any longer as well.
If New York isn't really your home, then why not just pack up and go to Alexandria? Why not pack up and go to Paris?
No, well, that's a good question. To go back to Alexandria is to go back to a place, as I've said, that does not exist any longer. The world of Alexandria, it's not just a geographical spot on planet Earth. It has to be an entire culture that I grew up in, a culture that was exceptionally rich and multifaceted. it doesn't exist anymore. It's now an Egyptian city, period. And Alexandria in particular was Nasser's sort of purpose was to take Alexandria and turn it into a totally Egyptian city. In fact, it's a place that doesn't feel very safe any longer for people who are not Alexandrians because it has become also rabidly fanatical. So that's not a world I would recognize. But as for going back to France, the France that I long for does not exist and never existed. It was an imaginary France. So when I go to France, I don't feel at home in France at all. I feel more at home on the Upper West Side in Manhattan than I would ever feel in France. And I feel the same way about Rome. Rome is an amazing city, but the longest I can live in Rome is about a month. After that, I don't want to live the way Italians do. When I first landed in Italy, just to give you some quick background, I thought that Italy was a totally backward country. Um, they needed, I mean, to just give you, they used to call Tide, the detergent, they used to call it Tide. And Ultra Bright, which was a toothpaste at the time, used to be spelled Ultra with Brait, so that people would pronounce it correctly. I I couldn't believe this. This would never have happened in Egypt. Certainly not in my Egypt of that period. So I landed in a country that was extremely backward. It was still recovering from World War II. So I could never belong there either, I realized. In fact, the place where I belong in the most is New York City right now. I don't think that I will ever move elsewhere. I couldn't think of another place that would tolerate a person like me and that would give me also the kind of multinational, multi-ethnic, multi-religious world that I need to be in order to feel partially at home.
Although Rome, especially Jewish Rome, has some pretty extraordinary food, doesn't it?
Well, if you go to those few restaurants that are in the what is used to be the Jewish ghetto, yes, I agree. It's amazing food, but how many fried artichokes are you going to eat before you
Well,
collapse?
you can have a few. You can go to Piperno, you can go to Dadigetto, and sort of you can make a rotation and have different fried artichokes.
Exactly. I mean, I like fried artichokes, but once every week, yes. But other than that, I just sicken. I do like Italian food. There's no question.
Okay. Uh, in this book, Homo Irrealis, and we've spoken a little about the title. We can talk more about the title, but it's a book about people and places and yourself. And there's Freud and there's Proust and there's Rome and Alexandria. And in painting portraits of people, you paint portraits of cities, and the other way around too. You can't separate the two, the place and the person. What is it about all this? Is it people who make up a place, or a place that makes up a person?
Well, um, it's that I find that people who have written about places with a sense of possible, and I'm not saying it happened, but with a sense of sort of a possible marginal displacement, feeling displaced in that place, has always attracted me. And what I've done in this book is that I've taken Cavafy, I've taken Sebald, I've taken Freud especially, and try to examine what they never really figured out about their connection to place. What is it about time and place that they almost figured out but didn't quite? And I realize that I'm taking a huge gamble in trying to explain to a reader that what they really experienced was what I say they experienced. Because I think that in many moments, even Proust, who's a writer that I totally respect and adore and teach, there are moments when he never finished his thought. And so I take it upon myself to say, if this is what you say, then this is what was implied in what you said. And this is how I understand it. Maybe totally wrong. In other words, it's not a book of criticism, but it's a book that speculates about the speculations of other people. It's basically how Freud, for example, loved Rome but never was able to go to Rome until very late in, or say, past his 40s, I think, when he went to Rome the first time. He kept putting it off, almost doing exactly what Hannibal had done. Hannibal arrives to Rome with his army and then makes the worst mistake of his career. He doesn't invade Rome, he stays out. And I think that Freud was doing the same thing. And so I asked myself, why is it that Freud never wanted to go to Rome? He gives us many explanations because he's not going to let the matter drop. But I think that his explanations are not exactly as honest as he could have made them. And so I take that there. And I find the same thing about Cavafy. Cavafy, who was a poet who's constantly writing about an Alexandria that probably he'd never met, that he lived in, but wasn't the real Alexandria that he was fantasizing about. It's sort of a kind of Hellenistic Alexandria in the early years of the 20th century, not possible. And so I realized that he's always thinking about the barbarians at the gate. This city, this culture is going to be destroyed eventually. People will invade Alexandria, or someone is going to take over this Alexandria of his fantasy, and it will be gone. And of course, Alexandria never really existed to begin with. It was always an invented place, like St. Petersburg, I like to say. A city that was created out of nothing. It didn't grow into something. It just was planned by the Ptolemies and by Alexander the Great, I suppose. And so it is always waiting for the barbarians. And the barbarians do come to Alexandria eventually. They came once. And I don't know if you want to call the current regime in Egypt barbarian, but it certainly changed the character and destroyed the Alexandria I knew.
And did he talk about the place in the book where you reference Cavafy and this poem, him going back to the building, going back to the room that's now an office, a room where he had made love many times, and he stands there and he looks around and says that the carpet was there and the bureau, and what's he doing, or what are you doing by quoting him?
Well, what I'm doing is, if I were to go back to Alexandria and I were to go back with one of my sons who's already nostalgic for it, even though he's never been there and might not even want to go when the moment comes to go. But if I were to go with him, I would point out to him in our apartment what was there, what used to be there. Here was a painting, there was a carpet, yes, there was a bureau, and try to recreate that moment as Cavafy does. He goes back to that apartment and he basically remembers what it was like. My theory is, and that's where I intrude on the poem itself shamelessly, is that I say that even when Cavafy was with his lover having sex on that bed that contains the band of sunlight on it, because in the afternoon the sun used to come on the bed, even when he was there, he knew already that one day he would come back, find the place totally altered because it has become a business office, and he would stand there and remember the old lover, the old bedroom, and so on and so forth. So I'm saying that the thought of Cavafy standing there was not something that happened once when he came there. It was already anticipated when he was having fun on that bed. And that is the nature of the Irrealis mood that I'm trying to describe and trying to capture, is that even in the past, when you were happy or whatever, you already anticipated a time when you would be standing on the outside of that room or outside of that bedroom and imagining what it is. I don't know if I'm conveying the thought as clearly as it would.
I think you are, and I think everybody knows the feeling, or at least I know the feeling. I think you do, of being very happy and then being shocked when you realize it's going to end sooner or later. The happiness is going to end maybe next year or maybe next month, and suddenly you're not so happy because you can't enjoy it as much as you want any longer.
Well, I'm going to give you an example that I'm sure you've lived with many times. You're in Rome, you're leaving the next day, flying back to the United States. Your friends are throwing a dinner party for you, and you're having a great time with those wonderful people whom you may not see for quite a while. And as you're enjoying the dinner and drinking the fantastic wine, and etc., etc., and the company is ebullient and happy, you're already marking this for the future. You're saying, I know tomorrow I'll be walking on the Upper West Side and I'll miss this, and I'm going to be miserable as hell because I'll miss it. I should not have left tomorrow. And as you're doing that, you're already ruining the present moment. You're kind of stealing from it the magic that it gives you because you're already anticipating missing it, filling it with regrets that haven't even occurred yet.
That's exactly it, and I have been there many times. And just the idea of being there and thinking in 12 hours I'm going to be in the airport security line. Just that, suddenly the food tastes worse.
Yeah, you've ruined your moment. And if you're in the company of people who live in the present tense, they'll say, stop doing what you're doing. I know exactly what you're doing. And you cannot ruin this moment. It's magical.
But how do you not ruin the moment?
You can't. You can't. And people, it's not that you ruin the moment, but you give it a character that it's not really meant to have. Uh, you can't be with someone you love that you won't see in the next few days or next few years. You can't be with them without already lamenting the fact that you're losing them. I can point out to having wonderful moments with someone who's about to die, and saying and having a wonderful time with them, and saying to them, or not saying it to them, but thinking it to yourself, here I am massaging this person with cream because their skin is drying and I'm supposed to do this. That's what they said at the hospital. And I know that in a few days, this skin will be dead and I will no longer be doing this. And I'm going to miss this terribly, even though right now we're having a wonderful heart-to-heart moment.
It reminds me of the great Austrian conductor Karl Böhm, I'm sure you're familiar with. And Böhm, in an interview, said something that a lot of people don't really think of it. I think he's on to something. He said all of Mozart's music has a sadness somewhere behind it. He said hidden very deeply is a great sadness that I, meaning Karl Böhm, hear in all of his music, and I sense it. He said even in the most happiest times, there's a tear in the eye there.
And he's so right. He is so right. But what he's doing exactly what I'm doing. He's seeing the tear that was very deftly concealed by the composer, because the composer was writing a happy moment. And if there was a tear, it's the conductor who brings it out if he wants to. And Karl Böhm was a great conductor, I have to say. And a great Mozart, because my first recordings of Mozart were Karl Böhm and Thomas Beecham. So, and I think both of them were, well, Thomas Beecham was a gregarious person, I think. And still, the sorrow that is in anything that Mozart wrote is implicit. It's just that if you bring it out too much, you are intruding on its inviolate character, if you want. But that is what I think performers and critics do all the time, is how do we intrude on a work without really changing the work? We just see something that nobody else has seen before. And do we have the courage to say it?
At the same time, there are conductors who I've played with who are very fine conductors who, when it comes to Mozart, they try to hide, they try to obfuscate or cloud or cover up the sadness. And they skim over it, I think, because they're afraid of it.
Well, I don't know. I mean, can you imagine somebody playing the Requiem without being sad?
Not quite. No, not the Requiem, no. But other pieces that have this underlying emotion, and then they sort of skim over it. You can tell they don't take it as seriously as the ebullient Mozart. And there's a disservice done. Mozart is very difficult to interpret, as the great pianist Arthur Rubinstein said, it's much too easy for kids and much too difficult for professionals.
I can understand that. Yes, I totally understand that. Yeah, I'm thinking as you're talking of the dissonant quartet, which is
Mm.
a sort of a difficult piece, and obviously it's not the happiest piece that Mozart wrote.
A lot of this book, Homo Irrealis, is about the prefix missed opportunities, missed experiences, misremembering. Is your life, André Aciman, is my life a series of misses, of almosts?
Well, as you know, there's a whole essay called Almost. Um, I think that in when you sort of open the ledger of your life and you find the things that you've done and the things that you might have done, then you realize that, I mean, I like to sort of define life in two ways. There are things that you are remorseful about, or that you feel that you basically you shouldn't have done this. You have a sense of remorse or guilt vis-a-vis certain things that you've done and you wish you hadn't done them. But when you look at the ledger of regrets, the things that you could have done, might have done, should have done, those are infinite. In other words, as you look at that ledger, you realize, oh my God, why didn't I do this? Why didn't I live there? Why didn't I make that decision instead of that decision? And you realize, my God, it's of course, life is only punctuated by moments of luck or bad luck, or however you want to call it. It's all unanticipated. But when I look at my own life, I see that there are so missed opportunities, so many missed things, missed people I should have met. I should have made an effort to meet that person. They wanted to meet me. And then they died or something like that. And you realize that, oh, I could have been a better person. I could have been a better son to my parents, who basically came to America for me, not really for themselves. They had no business being in America. Why didn't I take better care of them? Why didn't I make their lives happier? This is the kind of things that you look at that ledger and you feel, oh my God, this is awful. On the other hand, you can also say, well, life was what it was, and I made the best of it, and I still was a good son. I could have been a better son, but I was a very good son. I visited my parents when they were getting very, very old, almost every day, as did my brother. So we did what we had to do, and we did it with joy. So you can't inculpate yourself that much, but at the same time, you realize that the myths in your life are endless. And you wish, in other words, if you had to relive your whole life again, you probably would do the same things you did. And even if you knew that you shouldn't have done them or you should do them, but at the same time, there's a little pungency in there that sort of irks you and says, no, your life was not as perfect as you'd like to believe. And I think I have to leave it at that, because otherwise I'm going to have to find a couch somewhere where I can speak to a shrink and basically unload all my sufferings and so
Well, you can go onto a couch right now and continue this as we are.
on. That's true. You wouldn't know. That's right.
uh, Look, we've talked some about music. We've touched on music. You're obviously a great music lover, and since this is talking beats, beats usually meaning music rather than news, although sometimes news. I wonder, what do you listen to on a regular basis, or what are you listening to right now? People are going to think, what's he have on his record player?
No, I use Spotify quite a bit, and it depends. Sometimes I put. I'm thinking of writing a book with a friend on Neapolitan songs, which I happen to adore, and so I'm thinking of that, and so I'm listening to many Neapolitan songs sung by many singers, some famous, some not at all. But it's an interesting thing for me, so I listen to that a lot. But usually, what I like to listen to are, I mean, I love Beethoven sonatas, I like Schubert sonatas, I like to listen to chamber music a lot. Opera I like, but I cannot sit through a whole opera. I I no longer have the strength of character to sit through a whole Wagner opera. I need to leave at some point and just walk out. Um, but I like to listen to things, and I bike a lot. So on my bike, I always have music on.
Jews and Wagner. It's always interesting to it's the age old question, but I always find it interesting when people say, "Well, you shouldn't play or you shouldn't listen to Wagner." I said, "Wait a minute. His best friend was a conductor named Hermann Levy, who was the son of a rabbi. You're telling me that you know more about Wagner than he did?"
Well, I think Wagner post Hitler poses a lot of problems for many people. And I understand, I totally understand, but I don't espouse that. I never, as a professor of literature, I never allow the life of a particular writer to influence, or even their reputation to influence whether I like or not their books. Anti Semites are not exactly rare on our planet or in the history of our planet. And if I had to hate every possible Aspersion cast at Jews, I would have very few artists and very few um, books to read. I mean, hating Jews is not an unnatural, an unusual event.
You love languages. How many languages do you speak? And what do you, I mean, you write in English, but in terms of thinking, what are you thinking in?
I don't know. I used to ask my mother that question, and she was completely deaf and had always been deaf. And I once asked her, what language do you think in words? And she thought about it for a while, and she said, "You know what? I don't know." And I have to give you the same kind of answer. I don't know in what language I think. I don't know what thinking is, because when you're speaking, as we're doing right now, I am speech is my way of thinking. In other words, as I'm speaking, it's not that I have a hind thought before I speak. Speaking is a form of thinking, and as I write, writing is a form of thinking as well, a different kind of thinking. But if you ask me what language I think in, I don't know. I went to British schools, so I still count in English. Uh, but I spoke French at home, and Italian I picked up eventually, and now I find that my Italian is better than my French, which makes me very happy because I love Italian. And but French is my mother tongue, and and I love speaking French, and I love speaking Italian. I knew some Greek, but it's gone away. And Arabic I can still speak, but I can only speak in the street. I can sort of have a conversation with somebody in the street, but I can't discuss Marcel Proust in Arabic. No way. Spanish I can manage somehow, but not perfectly, because I grew up in a family where Ladino was spoken all the time. So these are languages that I'm familiar with. I'd studied German um, to no avail. In other words, I realized at some point that I probably am not really good at languages. I just was lucky enough to be brought up in Alexandria, where at least everybody I know from Alexandria speaks 4 to 5 languages.
I was thinking it would be a wonderful way to end this conversation if you would read something from some book that's around you right now that you really like right now. Do would you do that? Would you read an excerpt of something?
You want me to read an excerpt of something? I was reading yesterday. I was reading a Oh, okay, here it is. It's a scene that occurs when Swan is uh, he is with Odette for the first time they're together, and I think they will make love that same night, but he hasn't made any moves on her. And so I will read to you a paragraph. Is that okay?
I'd love it.
Okay. Swann ran his other hand upwards along Odette's cheek. She gazed at him fixedly with that languishing and solemn air which marks the women of the Florentine master, in whose faces he had found a resemblance with hers. Swimming at the brink of the eyelids, her brilliant eyes, wide and slender like theirs, seemed on the verge of welling out like two great tears. She bent her neck as all their necks may be seen to bend in the pagan scenes as well as in the religious pictures, and in an attitude that was doubtless habitual to her, one which she knew to be appropriate to such moments and was careful not to forget to assume. She seemed to need all her strength to hold her face back, as though some invisible force were drawing it towards Swan's. And it was Swan who, before she allowed it, as though in spite of herself, to fall upon his lips, held it back for a moment longer, at a little distance between his hands. He had wanted to leave time for his mind to catch up with him, to recognize the dream which it had so long cherished, and to assist in its realization like a relative invited as a spectator when a prize is given to a child whom she has been especially fond of. Perhaps, too, he was fixing upon the face of an Odette not yet possessed, not even kissed by him, which he was seeing for the last time, the comprehensive gaze with which, on the day of his departure, a traveler hopes to bear away with him, in memory, a landscape he is leaving forever. I don't know if this does it.
I think it does it. Why'd you pick that to read?
All right. Why did I pick that passage? Because it's a passage that when I read it many, many years ago, and I was reading it again, I realized that Swann was in fact about to kiss Odette and wanted all his past thoughts of possibly kissing Odette to be with him as he is kissing her. And at the same time, he's saying goodbye to an Odette that has never been kissed before. And therefore he knows as he's acquiring something, he's also losing it forever. And I think I included that passage in the Proust chapter in Homo Irrealis because it captures exactly the kind of things that you hope in the present moment you want to drag into it, all the hopes that you had built up and were pent up for that moment to be realized. And at the same time as this is happening, you're already looking to the future, to a time when you hadn't yet kissed Odette, and that now that you've kissed her, she's really no longer with any mystery for it, that no longer has any mystery left for you. So it is basically Swann in an Irrealis moment where he's not quite in the present, not in the past, and not in the future.
André Aciman, Homo Irrealis, the book of essays, reading Proust, talking about Proust and Schubert and time and all the rest, and I thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Really appreciate this. Thank you.
You've been listening to Talking Beats with Daniel Elchuk. The original theme music is by Ronald Barkham. The content coordinator is Nathaniel Mosé, and Doug Christian is executive producer. We invite you to subscribe and leave a 5-star review on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere you get your podcasts. You can support us at patreon.com/talkingbeats. That's patreon.com/talkingbeats. And be sure to check us out on social media. We'll see you next time on Talking Beats with Daniel Elchuk.